Morning to all of you. My name is Nirmala Ravishankar, and I had the privilege of serving as an external reviewer for a recent Progress Matrix exercise. And so Matt asked me if I could offer some reflections based on my experience. So I'm thrilled to be able to do that. And thank you for making time for this. So I thought I'd just start by giving a quick sense of the process that we followed, and then maybe a few reflections on what I understood to be our value as external reviewers, and then some final thoughts about potential risks or challenges that we noted as reviewers in the process. So Matt, if that sounds okay, and if any of this is duplicating what's already been said or discussed, just stop me or shout out or something.
Let's go ahead.
Okay. All right. So in terms of the process, there were this particular country's exercise was done by a team that included Ministry of Health folks, but the PI was someone who was a consultant contracted by the ministry. He'd been at the ministry until recently, and he was contracted to lead the exercise, and he had consulted widely with different stakeholders. The two reviewers were myself and a colleague from the WHO regional office. And we were sent the report as well as the scoring that the PI had done. We reviewed all the files individually and we scored all the questions based on our reading of the evidence as presented in the report. So in other words, we didn't go beyond the report to look at any source documents or talk to anybody additional. We were just basing our scoring based on the evidence as presented in the report. Then the two reviewers came together to discuss any divergence in our scoring or any notes that we had made about the original scoring. And we, to the extent that there was some divergence between our scores, that is the two reviewer scores, we discussed and aligned on a common score. And then all of that information was compared by the WHO country office person who was helping to coordinate this exercise. He then compared our scores, the reviewer scores, against the PI scores, and then set up a meeting with folks, with the PI and some key people from the Ministry of Health for all of us to discuss just the questions where there was some divergence between the PI scoring and the reviewer scoring. And we talked over an hour and a half about areas that were divergent, and then offered some advice and recommendations to the PI. The PI also had a chance to push back a little bit if he didn't agree with us. And then ultimately, it was left up to the country team to decide what the final score would be. So that was the process we followed. Unless there are any questions, I'll just say that just personally, I found the exercise really interesting. Not knowing anything about the country that I was reviewing and not going outside of the source documents, I was first thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to add any value to the process? But in the end, it felt like not knowing anything else about the country made it easier in some ways to just focus on the evidence presented in the documents and assess any potential inconsistencies between different sections of the documents or between responses to different questions within a given section. So for example, if under stage 1, there are multiple schemes mentioned, very commonly there is, a government financing scheme, perhaps a health insurance scheme, and private sector schemes. And then later on in various questions, there is a tendency to forget about the private sector schemes. So if there's a question about user fees in this particular country, there are no user fees in the public sector. So the PI had just said there are no user fees, but there are fees in the private sector, and the account and out-of-pocket expenditure in this particular country is quite high. So there's clearly some other issues going on. And so these kinds of inconsistencies, it was quite, in some ways, it was a bit easier to pick up for me as an external reviewer. I think the other reviewer who works at the WHO regional office was also able to provide a very valuable regional perspective and compare this particular country with other peers in the region. And I think that was exceedingly useful. And then I felt that collectively, the two reviewers, we played sort of a moderating role. So where the PI had scored very low, had scored just, scored the country on any question as 1, often we were sort of feeling like that's too low and sort of asking him to move it up a little bit. We felt he was being too harsh. And then on the other extreme, where he had scored at 4, I feel like both of us were generally of the opinion that, hold on a second, there's always room for improvement, and 4 seems too high. And so I feel like in this particular exercise, I'm not saying that this is always the case, but it felt like the reviewers were playing the sort of moderating role. In terms of then finally, just some reflections from my side on potential risks or challenges to look out for as you're all embarking on these exercises. One goes back to this issue that I stated before about inconsistencies across sections. I think it's very easy to, especially given that many of you are from ministries of health, to focus on certain schemes and certain parts of the health system that you're all spending most of your time thinking about, but to not lose sight of other mechanisms and other schemes and financial flows, and make sure that you're looking at the full sort of pie of health expenditure when you're developing your responses for all the sections. That would be the first area. The second, I feel like there's a tendency, and this, I also came across when I used to work a lot in national health accounts and do trainings for national health accounts. Something about the questions around pooling immediately leads people to think about health insurance. And in the African context, there's a lot of discussion in many countries about setting up new health insurance schemes, and there's a lot of back and forth on that. But to keep in mind that pooling is not just about health insurance, but also, general revenue financed health expenditure controlled by the Ministry of Health or local governments is also pooled funding. And often the bigger chunk of health expenditure, certainly in most countries in Africa, but even in many countries in Asia. And so to resist that or not fall into that trap of just conflating pooling with health insurance would be another cautionary word of caution, I guess. And then finally, the recommendations, to ensure that the recommendations are grounded in the evidence presented in the report, in the sections. It seems such a silly thing to say, but it felt like in this particular instance, when it came to the recommendation section, there was a temptation to add in all kinds of ideas that seem very important for the sector and perhaps very timely, but they weren't well grounded in the evidence presented in the actual assessment. So I'm it's fine to make all those recommendations, provided it derives from the evidence presented, or making sure that that connection is there and obvious between the evidence presented and the recommendations presented would be the final, somewhat mundane, but still important, I think, reflection that I'd like to offer. So let me stop there and see, Matt, if that it came close to what you were hoping, and if people have any questions or comments, I'm happy to try and answer them.